Another problem we noted with the issue of what to do about the lighthouse, not just having the ocean above you, but having it start to come into the ground underneath you. And if that salt water is coming to your well, that's not good to drink. So as sea level rises, we're going to see more sea level pushing in under the ground and more problems with salt water into wells and things like that. Here's an example. This is a map of southern Louisiana from 1990. And go forward not quite a quarter century. What used to be southern Louisiana is now mostly south of Louisiana in the water. Now, of course, Louisiana, not only do you have the general rise of sea level happening, but Delta, you've got the compaction, so the ground is tending to sink down, and we don't have more flooding of the Mississippi tending to dump sand and mud over top of it. Plus, South Louisiana, a lot of oil and gas has been pumped out from under the ground. That's no longer under the ground. Stuff will sink down as well. So you've got multiple factors all leading to quite dramatic change in what's flooded versus land. Actually, Dr. Jones knows somebody with a fishing shack right about in here. Used to be a half-hour drive to get there. Now it's more like a 2-hour boat ride to get there. For much longer, that shack's going to be a boat. I've got a link here. You can take a look. Gives forecasts for coasts around the U.S. And you can see what areas are particularly vulnerable. Not too surprisingly, very flat areas like South Florida or a lot of the east end of North Carolina are some of the particularly easily flooded areas. I mean, even now, coastal cities like Miami, like Charleston, South Carolina, are seeing increasing problems with flooding. Norfolk, Virginia Beach area in Virginia, another region, that whole Hampton Roads area is facing problems. Glaciers melting. Here's an example from the Andes in Peru, where the glacier was in 78 versus 2004. Much further back there. Obviously, this is going to be a big deal if you happen to live, say, right there. Conditions change quite a bit. What about those of us not living near a glacier? Well, we live downstream. Now, of course, no glaciers near North Carolina, but in places where you have glaciers up in the mountains, melt from the edge of the glacier can be an important source of water flowing on into rivers. If the whole glacier melts away, that won't be there anymore. And we are seeing problems there. Perhaps the place where this is the biggest problem is in Central Asia. Of course, you've got the Great Big Mountains, the Himalayas, and many others there. And so there are a number of glaciers up in the mountains. Meltwater from those glaciers, in turn, is headwaters for a number of the major rivers. And this is particularly important when you get more into the interior, like in northwestern China or over into, say, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, all those countries there. Things are kind of dry. If you don't have that river water, you don't have water. That's not good. And already, under Soviet policies, you had rather poor use, using up a lot of the water and dumping chemicals, all sorts of negative things. They've got problems already. This is tending to make it worse. Plus, there's a lot of historical and current fighting. People in these places aren't overly great at nicely sitting down and agreeing how to share things. If they're out of water, that's not going to make them happier. Now, some things are making adjustments. the organisms and people that are able to adjust are doing okay. Ones that aren't, they're generally experiencing problems. And so we can look at a number of different patterns here. For example, how do plant communities shift over time? We can go back, look at fossil evidence of where plants were with the glaciers coming and going in the ice ages, and compare that to where they live today. And no surprise, there are changes. Now, of course, a tree can get up and run away from the glacier, but if the glaciers are advancing, those tree seeds will tend to be growing better more to the south and not so great to the north. So over time, different types of plants will be growing different places. But it turns out each type of plant has its own particular preferences and adjusts independently of the others. It's not all the types of trees that we might see today, especially if we hadn't cut so much down, were also found all together just further south. Each one moves in its own pattern. For example, if you want to find hemlock trees today, then head for the mountains. There are some in South Mountains Park, or if you get on up into the Blue Ridge. But if you want to, say, see Spanish moss, then you need to head for the coast, or maybe down to Florida. Go back into Ice Age with glaciers widespread, reaching all the way, covering as far as northern Pennsylvania. And we had hemlock and Spanish moss together. And so the conditions that hemlock needs and the conditions Spanish moss needs actually overlapped in location back then. They don't now. Okay, so different plants are found in different places. So what? Well, two important things. One, that will work if the plants are able to make the adjustment. There's enough time for seeds from this one to grow a little bit in the new direction, and then their seeds grow a little bit in the new direction. So if it happens too fast, that's not going to work. Also, those of us who aren't plants tend to depend on more than one kind of plant. And if the types of plants that one animal needs, or that or other types of organisms, if they're no longer together, that's going to cause some problems. So, again, more gradual adjustment, there's more chance to do something. Change too fast, more things are in trouble. How do you know when it's time to do things? For example, springtime, we're seeing lots of flowers, leaves on things. We're seeing some different kinds of birds coming back from migration. We're seeing a lot of insects that we haven't been seeing in the winter. Lots of things are going on in the spring. But how do you know that it's spring? Well, there are several different clues that you might use. For example, is it getting warm out there? That's a useful hint. And so a plant might start growing after the winter dormancy when temperatures get to a certain level of warmth. Okay, that works pretty well, as long as we don't have then a sudden cold snap and then a plant that started growing up might be in trouble. For example, you've probably noticed that water tower just a little ways south of Boiling Springs, the Gaffney peach. And they have a peach water tower because they grow lots of peaches in Cherokee County and Spartanburg County as well, nearby areas. Growing peaches, turns out that you tend to get the best price for your peaches if you're getting them to market early, the first ones coming in the year. Candy companies and the like are interested in having fresh peaches again after the old supply is running out. So there's an incentive to plant peaches that will flower and ripen fruit earlier. And if we've got a relatively early spring, things stay warm, that peach crop can be quite impressive, rivaling what is produced by all of Georgia. On the other hand, if they've got all early peaches and we get a late cold snap, they may not get real good harvest at all. What's the clue that tells you, yes, this is time it's going to be safe to grow? Another thing you can do is maybe check out the other thing growing around you. If you're starting to see the leaves coming back on the trees, flowers, stuff like that, okay. Looks like springtime out there. Time to do spring stuff. You can use that type of clue. Different types of plants and animals can rely on cues of that sort. Of course, another thing we can do to tell if it's spring, calendar says so. It says spring started officially March 20th, so it must be spring, it's after that. Now, of course, plants and animals can't go look at the calendar and figure it out, but they do have various clues to tell where you are in the year. For example, the length of the day. As we move into spring, the days are getting longer, and that can be used as a clue. But again, the challenge is different things relying on different guidelines. Different living things depend on each other. So, for example, if a plant puts out its flowers and the bees haven't showed up yet, that plant's got a problem. And then the bees come, the plant's not there, the bees may have a problem. Or, say, birds that migrate from South America to here, they can't look around and see if the plants are starting to bud. They have to decide this is the right time of year and go ahead and fly. So, if different things that depend on each other get out of sync because they're relying on different cues, that can be a problem. For example, birds depend heavily for migrating and nesting here on lots of nice, yummy, protein-rich bugs to feed those babies hatching out. And you get lots and lots of bugs coming along pretty soon after those plants first start to put out their leaves and flowers. Now, if all of those coordinate, that works. But say if the plants and insects are moving earlier, and the birds are still on the same schedule, they'll show up too late and have more trouble feeding the young. Northern expansion. Here in the northern hemisphere, if you like cooler conditions, well, how about moving north? Well, that can work for some things. But some things are making those adjustments, others not so much. There are some limits. For example, if you are an animal that likes to live in a forest, and that forest is getting a little warm, okay, start heading north. And hey, this isn't a forest, this is a city. I don't want to try to walk through there, or if it does try, it's likely to get run over or something. Do we have connected areas where things can make these moves? Again, some types of plants and animals are making the adjustments, some not so much so. For example, the rusty patch bumblebee was recently listed as an endangered species because with global warming, we're seeing these ones in the south part of its range dying out, but they haven't really managed to move north at the north end. So their range is getting smaller. There's significant decline in the population, and it's of concern. So we have the official protection there. Could we change something to try to counteract the warming? Well, maybe there are various ideas out there. For example, okay, we get most of our energy from the sun in the air, so let's stick a bunch of stuff up there and block some of that sunshine. Well, that probably would cool things off. Might have some other effects. What if things go wrong? We only got one Earth, there's not much option if we mess it up. So, definitely need to be careful about this sort of thing. Now, true, if there are ways that we can decrease how much carbon dioxide we're putting out there, well, that's directly dealing with the problem. That's not changing something else and hoping it all balances out. Or perhaps even taking carbon dioxide out of the air. The more we can do that, actually, we're already seeing some problems with warming. If we could bring it back to what it was before we were putting so much carbon dioxide in the air, that could be a good thing. But getting carbon dioxide, that takes some effort. We have to do things. Now, one good thing, planting trees, if you're in an area where trees should be growing, not say out in the desert somewhere where you're wasting water to grow a tree, but if you are planting trees, that's one good way of all that substance of tree, most of that's made of carbon taken out of the air. So there are some things that can help, but again, it's got to be the right place to balance properly. There are also, say, basalt rocks, our standard ocean floor type rock, also found in various places on land. If we put carbon dioxide in with that, it tends to react and make carbonate minerals instead, which of course they're not in the air, they're not warming things up, but it's work to put it in there. There are only certain places that have that nice big supply of available basalt. It's not something that we can just, oh, that'll fix things. Yeah, saying, nah, I don't need to do something, technology, they'll solve it sometime. Not a good strategy. For one thing, the chances of technology solving things are a lot better if the problem's not as bad. If we can decrease how much carbon dioxide we're putting out there in the first place, the ability to clean up the rest is much more likely to happen than if we just crank out all we might feel like. So, to avoid major problems on the climate, we really need to cut back on how much carbon dioxide we are putting into the air, and maybe even take some out would be even better. So less use of fossil fuels. That's kind of the number one thing there. Greater efficiency. Switching more towards electric hybrid cars versus your standard gas ones. We're making some progress there, but there's quite a ways to go. Other lower energy appliances, things like that. Thinking culturally, what are some things that we do that, well, we don't really have to, it's just kind of a tradition or whatever. So, for example, why do you mow your lawn? Because everybody else does, and your neighbors or your parents or somebody complains if you don't. Okay, but well, why does everybody do it? Why would they complain? Now, true, having a total mess, that's probably not so good, but maybe a garden might be a good alternative. Now, true, if you are actually using lawn space for something, say a good place for kids to run around, something like that, well, you're actually using it. But if you're just cutting your grass because people cut grass, well, having plants grow more and store up carbon rather than keeping cutting it might be a better thing to try to have more happening. That's just one example. Not that lawns are horrid, but they're not always useful either. And there are many other things that we can think about. There's some other things also that would be an advantage of using fossil fuels less. For example, there's a lot of other pollution, not just carbon dioxide. A lot of that's rather nastier. You have things like sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides tend to be produced by burning. And that creates smog and acid rain and major health problems, issues there. We get oil spills, coal dust dumped around, things like that. These are additional problems there. Political considerations. A lot of the countries that are selling lots of fossil fuels, the governments aren't exactly really the folks that we would generally want to be giving loads of money to. They tend to not be so nice in various ways. If we decrease how much fossil fuel we're using, then we're not going to be buying as much stuff from them. And there's only a certain amount. If you use stuff up, it's gone. Well, duh. But an awful lot of people don't seem to figure that out. We are using up fossil fuels, the easier to get to stuff. We've gotten an awful lot of it. We need to think about long term. Are we going to have enough for other needs rather than just burning stuff? There's a lot of things we can make with it. Plastics, different fibers, stuff like that. Just burning it all up isn't a great option there.